Hey guys, Weeby News here, and today we'll be talking about the executions of Super Danganronpa 2. And before we start, I wanted to thank you guys for all the love in the last video. It seemed like you guys really enjoyed it, so I figured I'd go ahead and make a sequel for the second game. Also in this video, there won't be any spoilers for Danganronpa V3, so if you haven't played that game, you're free to watch this video. I will be mentioning the Danganronpa 3 anime at one point later in the video, but I'm going to give a spoiler warning beforehand, so if you want to skip that section and remain unspoiled, you can. Also again, these will just be my own interpretations and other interpretations that I found online, so I'm just explaining these executions to the best of my knowledge, but I'm not Kadaka, so obviously take these explanations with a grain of salt. And one last thing, there is a lot more Japanese words in this video than the last one. I tried my best to say them all right, but I'm sure I butchered a few of them, so I apologize in advance. But yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into the video. First up is Teruteru Hanamura's execution, which opens up similarly to Leon's from the first game, with him getting dragged from the neck by a metal chain, surrounded by his onlooking classmates. The rest of the execution consists of him getting aggressively bombarded by missiles full of egg and flour, before being lifted and dropped into an active volcano, where he is fried to the point that he looks like an entree. The obvious irony shown here is that the ultimate chef is getting cooked alive, and that's really the main gist of this execution, but there's a little bit more to go in depth on, so I'm going to do that. The English localization of the game translated the name to Deep Fried Teruteru, but the Japanese title is slightly different. Its Romaji reading is Tonkatsu no Hanamura. Tonkatsu is a Japanese dish that consists of a fried breaded pork cutlet, and is probably, as you guessed it, what this execution's premise is based on. I couldn't find too many reasons as to why they chose this dish, but I think one reason was likely that Monokuma wanted to insult him by comparing him to a pig. This is even shown by having a drawing of Teruteru as a pig in the title card, and the second being that in Teruteru's report card, it mentions that he dislikes junk food, so I think deep frying him to death could have been another way that Monokuma was trying to torture him, considering fried food is usually associated with being junk food. So in a way, I feel like Monokuma was trying to turn him into what he hated. Also, slightly related, during his fourth free time event, he cooks Hajime a simple meat and potato stew, and during the event, he tells Hajime to imagine it happening realistically before expressing horror on his face. Hajime thinks to himself how it would be no longer food but a weapon at that point, and at first I assumed that this was referencing his own execution, maybe hinting at himself melting to death from the lava, but I think this is most likely a reference to Celeste's execution from the previous game, the burning of the Versailles Witch, since he reveals that the name of this dish is Versailles-style meat and potato stew. Lastly, one other interesting thing about this execution is that for the most part, what happened to Teruteru in the Lake of Lava was pretty accurate. In other pieces of media, characters who are pushed into a lava lake fall under the lava as if they were drowning in water, but in reality, because lava is so much more dense than water, you wouldn't sink after falling in it, but instead would float, just like Teruteru does. Next up is Pekko's execution, also known as One Woman Army. This execution sets up showing Pekko on what seems to be a deserted part of the island, surrounded by robot samurais. In the first few moments, we see some large waves crashing against the island's cliff. These waves are a reference to the Great Wave of Kanagawa, an extremely famous art piece made by Katsushika Hokusai. Before she begins attacking the legion of robot samurais that surround her, we see that Monokuma is controlling what looks to be a puppet version of herself. This part was always what confused me the most regarding this execution, but on second thought, there seems to be a reason that they included this. While researching, I found this comment on her execution, which was a real eye-opener for me when thinking about the symbolism shown in it. Before it starts, we see Pekko tell Monokuma that she's willing to accept her punishment and that as long as she is a tool, she's willing to die. And in response, he says that he thinks it's likely she'll shed tears of despair by the end of it. The whole execution after this conversation parallels this exchange in my opinion. It appears that as the robots surround her, she's facing towards Fuyuhiko, who's onlooking from the outside of the crowd. She then begins fiercely destroying each and every robot one by one, likely in order to reach her young master in order to protect him as his tool. All the while, Monokuma is puppeteering her tool version, symbolizing how she thinks of herself as such. But because she's not actually thought of as that, Fuyuhiko rushes into the battle scene in order to try and save her, but because she's so distracted on trying to reach and save him as his tool, she ends up hurting him in the process, which I feel like parallels their relationship perfectly. As I'm sure most of you guys remember, during the chapter when Pekko saw that Fuyuhiko was angered with Mihiru to the point that he was ready to kill her, she stepped in his place, committing the act for him. She did this in an attempt to try and save him from the killing game. Her plan was basically to take the fall as the killer, and then after everyone voted for her, frame it in a way that makes it seem as if Fuyuhiko was the true killer who was simply using her as his weapon. This way, he could be considered under the blackened and could escape the island alone. It's a perfect plan in order to ensure his safety for at least another round, since if he is ruled the blackened after the vote, he can escape, and if he isn't, then he's still safe for at least another round. But because she was so preoccupied with trying to protect him physically, she didn't realize that emotionally she hurt him in an irreversible way since he cared so deeply for her. This is symbolized in the execution when she physically hurts him there, again because she was too focused on being a tool. This moment is of course what Monokuma was alluding to when he said she likely shed tears of despair. Not only did she end up hurting the one person she cared about, but in her last moments, this parallel may have made her realize how the one thing she took pride in, being his tool, was what hurt him the most, both physically and emotionally. Finally, she told Monokuma that as long as she was a tool, she'd never feel despair, but at the end of this execution, being a tool was exactly what brought her despair, which I feel like was very ironic. But with all of that depressingness out of the way, let's focus on the trivia. The Japanese title for this execution is Aberanbo Shoujo, which is referencing a 1978 Japanese drama series called Aberanbo Shogun. The drama follows a wandering shogun who travels his lands under a fake identity, capable of eliminating a huge number of enemies using a katakana as his weapon. Peko similarly shares these capabilities as shown during the execution, and also faked her identity during the killing game at Fuyuhiko's request. It's also worth noting that the drama series logo is pretty similar to the execution card as well. Next up on the list is Mikan's execution, which is known as Bye Ouchies in the English version, and it's probably one of the weirdest and honestly most disliked executions by the fandom. I feel like I've seen a lot of people complain about it, including myself, I'm not gonna lie, but I was pleasantly surprised to learn that there is more to this execution than just fan service, which was my first impression of it. Firstly, the English title Bye Ouchies is very similar to the Japanese version Pain Pain Go Away. Both are very childish phrases. Notably too, the wiki points out that the Japanese title was written in a childlike way as well. The word tondeke is a colloquial alteration of the more formal deteke that is commonly used by young children. They likely use such childlike language to reference the immense amount of childhood trauma Mikan faced, which she describes to Hajime during her free time events. Moving on though, I'd like to focus on what actually happened during her execution. It opens up with Mikan laying down in a hospital room, then Monokuma rushes in with a giant needle, and it appears that he's going to stab her with it, but instead he stabs the ground underneath them, causing the hospital set to fall and a giant arm to appear underneath them. This is the very first piece of personalized despair just for Mikan, because in her report card, it explicitly shows that she dislikes oversized objects, so using both the oversized needle and the arm was likely meant as a way to torment her. I was also just trying so hard to rack my brain on why Monokuma chose a giant arm to blast her off in, because it just seems so random, but if you look at her design, you'll notice that her left arm is covered in bandages, and it looks like the giant arm in the execution is a left arm replica, so I think it was likely meant to reference that. In her free time events, it's revealed that she suffered an immense amount of physical abuse growing up, and that she couldn't rely on anyone else to help fix her afterwards, and that this led her to having to treat herself and her own injuries. So I think it's likely that this arm bandage was meant to cover up some of the more extreme wounds that she endured from this toxic environment, and I think that Monokuma likely used this arm as a way to remind her of the awful abuse she faced. But after the arm appears beneath her, Monokuma begins to repeatedly inject it with Mikan sitting atop of it. These repeated injections seem to affect the arm a good bit, causing it to turn red and potentially squirming from pain. I think this again was likely meant to reference the abuse she faced. Specifically, I think it could be meant to remind her of what exactly happened to her arm that caused her to bandage it so heavily. Next, we see Mikan react to the arm pulsing beneath her. This execution makes me so uncomfortable. But anyways, this goes on to the point that it forces her to fully react, if you catch me. And this was likely meant to reference the implied sexual trauma that she refers to during her free time events, and was also used by Monokuma, likely as a way to torture her some more. But after this, the arm launches off like a rocket ship into space, killing her somehow. The moment of death isn't actually shown in this, neither is her after she's died, which I feel like is another kind of strange thing about this execution. Moving on though, I've seen a lot of people mention an alternate interpretation of this execution as well, this being that the entire execution was hallucinated by Mikan, and that in actuality, Monokuma did stab her with a needle, which caused her to dream up this execution before dying of an overdose. I couldn't really find any proof to back up this theory, but I do like it nonetheless. I found this one comment too, which I feel like was an interesting take on the amount of feelings that Mikan was experiencing during this execution as well. Basically, they state that the reason she was so happy was because as she lay dying, she was dreaming of being propelled to her beloved Junko. I think I prefer this interpretation personally, and since Mikon did remember being in ultimate despair at this point and enjoyed experiencing despair again, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to think that her brain would come up with all the despair-inflicting aspects that I mentioned before, but unfortunately, I'm not totally convinced. The execution is super weird, but they were stuck in a virtual world, so it's not an impossible scenario to happen considering that, but regardless, it's a fun theory, and I just thought I'd share it with you guys. Next up is Gundam's execution, Gundam Tanaka Stampede. Gundam's execution opens up with Monokuma charging towards Gundam with a stampede of wild animals. Gundam bids farewell to his hamsters and moves to the path in which the stampede is traveling. While they're moving towards him, he begins drawing what looks to be an alchemy circle before being directly hit by the mob and dying shortly after. There's several pieces of media that this execution could be referencing. The first and most likely more obvious one to Western audiences is The Lion King. This execution seems to be referencing Mufasa's death scene pretty hard, with the desert landscape surrounding them and Monokuma leading a stampede towards him. The hamsters coming to his side after he was hit is likely referencing Simba when he similarly found his father after the stampede, and afterwards it references the movie again with Gundam's face appearing in the sky while the hamsters look towards him, just like the "Remember Who You Are" scene in Lion King when Simba speaks to his father's ghost. The last reference to this movie is through the music used, the track being called The Last High King, which sounds pretty similar to The Lion King, and also the song sounds a good bit like The Lion Sleeps Tonight. The execution also references Mobile Suit Gundam 0079 through its Japanese title, Gundam Falling to the Earth. This, according to the wiki, is referencing the famous scene where the RX-78-2 Gundam fell to Earth after a battle against Zeon Ace Char Unzabel, befitting the reference to the Gundam series made through Gundam Tanaka's name. Finally, there are some other references to the shonen genre in this execution, one of them being the alchemy circle and the summoning that very strongly resembles the alchemy used in Full Metal Alchemist and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. The Japanese title of this execution uses furigana, which is a Japanese reading aid consisting of smaller hiragana placed over kanji to indicate the proper pronunciation to those who are unfamiliar with them. It's something that's very commonly used in shonen manga. Also, slightly related, all of Gundam's hamsters' names are based off of shonen manga magazines too. Sandy referencing Shonen Sunday, Junpei being Shonen Jump, Magazi being Shonen Magazine, and Champi being Shonen Champion. It's likely that all the shonen references relating to Gundam and its execution are because of his Chunibyo personality, which if you don't know is a Japanese term used to describe a person who manifests delusional behavior, particularly thinking that one has special powers that no one else has. So these references, especially the hamster names, are likely implying that he is very into shonen manga. And finally, I'd like to talk about the alchemy circle and what exactly he was doing there. I've seen a couple of different theories regarding it, and I'd like to share both. Firstly, there's a rumor that I've seen going around a lot claiming that he made the circle to protect his hamsters. I can't find any evidence for it though. Everyone that I've seen mention it states that it's a fact, but I've never seen any sources with it. It's always just kind of like, trust me bro, and so I don't think that it's confirmed in any way. I like this idea because it is really sweet, but I sort of lean towards believing the other theory, which is that it was in fact meant to protect himself and was supposed to represent his attitude of fighting for life until the very end, which was the message he was really trying to portray to the group during the 4th trial. But I know what you're thinking, if he did it to protect himself, then why didn't it do anything? Well, it was probably because he was just writing the alphabet over and over again in his little magic circle. Kidding, but really, what is this? But actually, what I was thinking is that again, he was doing this because he decided to fight for his life until the end, because honestly, it would be hypocritical for him to give up now after what he told the others, which is another reason why I don't really believe the protecting the hamsters theory. But in this situation, he's trying to protect himself using magic, which greatly relates to his Lord of Darkness Chubi persona, and then just when it seems like it's working, it fails miserably. I think this was probably set up by Monokuma to give Gundam the most despair, because this whole game is set in a virtual world. Monokuma made it seem like Gundam did in fact have powers for a few seconds and was going to be able to fight back with them, but then it does absolutely nothing and he fails miserably. And I think this was so that Monokuma could throw in his face that his persona is a fraud and that he is in fact delusional. At least that's how I interpret it. Finally, it's interesting to me that he's pulled to heaven in this execution. It's strange considering he's always claiming to be such an evil overlord of darkness, and I feel like this could represent how he was truly a good person the whole time, and again, I think this could be potentially a way for Monokuma to taunt him, showing again that his evil magical persona was in fact fake. But that is all I have to say about Gundam's execution. Last but not least, we have Chiaki and Monami's execution. Surprisingly, there's not too much to discuss about this one, trivia and analysis-wise, but I will do my best. One interesting thing is that unlike all the other executions in the series thus far, this execution's name remained unchanged in the English translation. It's also the first execution where the name is written in English in the original Japanese version, since the English phrase "insert coin" is typically left untranslated in Japanese video games. Since the execution was created for the Ultimate Gamer Grill, it references several famous game titles. Starting out, the room where the tank is shooting at Chiaki and the Monami army is a Space Invaders reference. After this, Chiaki finds the exit and runs into the hallway, and in this scene, they are chased by a giant rolling ball that seems to resemble Pac-Man a pretty good bit. Then finally, when they're trapped into the final room, they're crushed by giant blocks that are obviously a reference to Tetris. One thing I do find really cool about this execution and all the old references in it is that it's titled "Insert Coin Here," referring to old arcade machines that tick coins. Then all the games inside of it are old arcade games as well, making it very thematic. Also, "Insert Coin Here" is likely referring to Chiaki and Monami, since their pixel images are shown under the credit section of the Tetris setup. Basically, I think it's really cool that they made this into some kind of sick murder arcade game where you pay in the people you want to execute. Next, we're going to talk about the executions that may have been referenced in the Danganronpa 3 anime. So if you haven't seen it, skip to the time shown on the screen. That way you can avoid spoilers and stuff. Okay, is everybody gone? Okay, so for this section, I'm only going to talk about Chiaki's anime execution. I just wanted to make it sound vague to avoid, like, slightly spoiling people who haven't seen it. Honestly, for me, the Danganronpa 3 anime has aged like milk, but one thing I did like about it was how despair-inducing this execution was. There's some parallels between the two, which I think is really interesting. In both the executions, Chiaki is looking for an exit. In the anime one, it says goal, and in the game one, it says exit. And both of these quote-unquote exits lead to where they're finally killed. Both are also chased by large boulder-like balls too. In the game one, it looks like Pac-Man, and in the anime one, it has a very Indiana Jones vibe to it. The wiki notes that our anime execution is pretty similar to Makuro's and Trigger Happy Havoc, since both are suddenly impaled by a dozen of spears, and they also double as acts of betrayal from the ones they were closest to, Junko in Makuro's case, and Chisa in Chiaki's case. Also, in the stage rendition of Super Danganronpa 2, her AI counterpart is executed by spear impalement as well. But that is it for that section. Finally, we've reached the bonus execution section. Unfortunately, it is going to be a bit of a letdown. Two of these I definitely never really thought of as being executions, but the wiki labeled them as such, so I feel like I should mention them. These two are Monami's unnamed execution, where Monokuma uses the Mono Beast to shoot at her repeatedly. There's no trivia on the wiki for this one, so I'm just kind of mentioning it for the sake of mentioning it, mostly so I don't get comments about it, so sorry. The next one is Akane's unnamed execution, where Monokuma aims a bazooka at her due to her breaking one of the school rules. Before the weapon is able to make impact though, Nekomaru steps in to save her. Similarly, there's not that much information about it, but the wiki does note that it's the only execution where the wrong recipient was injured instead of the intended recipient, which I feel like is true, since although Fuyuhiko was injured in Pekko's execution, in this scenario, Akane, the one who was intended to receive the punishment, was able to avoid execution, unlike Pekko. And the last execution in this bonus section is Forced Shutdown, aka Junko's AI execution. The wiki notes that it's the only 3D execution in the franchise, and that it also uses a remix of the False Hope opening of the game. But anyways, this will conclude the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I was kind of surprised to see that there was a lot less information online about these executions. A lot of these really are just my own interpretations of the executions, so I felt a lot less validated when making this video than the last one. But yeah, hopefully you guys still enjoyed it. Please leave a like or a comment if you did, and if you guys want, I'd be happy to make one for V3. Just let me know in the comment section if that's something you guys want. Anyways, once again, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you real soon.